All right, thanks for the introduction, Rennie, and thanks for everyone for taking time out of your day to attend. Apparently, Google and healthcare is a pretty popular topic. We have a lot to go through today, but again, all slides and recordings will be sent after the webinar, so no need to take notes. In broad strokes, we're going to start by talking about Google's organization structure, followed by their strategy to find healthcare solutions and their advantages in this space. Then we're going to talk about what they've been actively doing in the disease management and data infrastructure / cloud services space. And finally, we'll wrap up at the end with talking about where we think they may be going next. Without further ado, let's get started. I thought some good context would be to understand Google's overall structure and where the health divisions fit in. And the first thing to point out is that it's no longer Google's organization structure. They've now reorganized into a holding company called Alphabet with a bunch of different divisions. And the company restructured in 2015 with the core Google business as well as a bunch of other divisions, and a few of them related to healthcare. The main three that are really focused on the area are Verily, whose mission is to use data and new tools to better healthcare; Calico, which is focused on understanding aging; and DeepMind, which is Google's AI research division, which has a big focus in healthcare applications, which we'll talk about later. Now, we know a bit about the structure, so when I talk about Verily, Google, Calico, Alphabet, and DeepMind, you'll get what I'm referring to different parts of the same organization. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on who does what. So with the organization down, how is Google actually trying to crack the healthcare space? Where's it looking? And what are the strengths that it can play to? First thing to keep in mind, Google's style has traditionally been shoot high and go for lofty goals. They used to name their projects moonshots for pretty good reason. But it turns out that it's hard to jump straight to the moon in healthcare. The company attempted to make its own personal health record called Google Health about a decade ago, which shut down, and more recently its tactic of breaking down biology and building a universal diagnostic machine was met with some difficulty. So the company has toned down the goal setting a bit and looked more to more realistic and commercial solutions. The company is expanding its surface area to find the places that it can have impact in healthcare. The main ways it's doing this is by increasing its exposure to startups, looking outside of the US, and establishing a partnership strategy with large existing players that have their own expertise. When it comes to startups, one thing Verily has done is bought a massive lab space in southern San Francisco and is inviting startups to come work alongside the Verily team in those labs. Companies like Freenome and Culture Robotics are working right next to the Verily team, which enables a culture of cross-pollination of their technologies, first footing into potential acquisition targets, and more. The startup exposure the company is getting isn't just in the US. Verily also has become an LP in a European-based VC, Medici Ventures, and other areas it's looking internationally include Asia broadly. Google made an investment in an AI biotech startup in China, and Verily itself actually raised $800 million from the Singapore sovereign wealth fund Temasek with the stated intention of partnering and commercializing more in Asia. Oops, looks like I actually skipped a slide. But here we can see that Google Ventures, its venture arm, is actually increasing its investment pace into healthcare, which is especially notable because Google Ventures has actually decreased its overall investing pace as a whole. So the fact that they're increasing in healthcare is pretty notable, and that's probably only going to continue even more considering its large exit in Flatiron Health recently. And so, like I said here, they're looking abroad, both on the startup side through VC funds and also investments, and also through being invested from sovereign wealth funds. So finally, when it comes to finding innovation, they've actually heavily focused on a partnership strategy with a lot of the existing health giants. So they're really getting their expertise in commercialization and the actual healthcare, their knowledge of actual healthcare problem areas. The partnerships are really all across the board: Johnson & Johnson, NHS, Sanofi, Dexcom, and a lot more. So what Google brings to the table in these partnerships is largely their expertise in artificial intelligence. That's one of their main advantages, though they also have the benefits of a large consumer base and distribution to consumers, as well as cash, just like any other tech company getting involved in the space. But I want to start with the AI focus, because this is really what makes Google unique. The company is essentially rebuilding its entire business around AI differentiation and launching different products and attacking different areas that they think they can be differentiated really substantially by using AI. So that includes healthcare. More and more health data is being generated thanks to cheaper sensors, more people online. The amount of relevant health data is growing exponentially. And that data is actually coming from a lot of different places. So not only do we have a massive volume of data, but the areas they're coming from are totally siloed, and they don't have the context of each other's data sets to make sense. So with this in mind, this explosion of random data sets is where Google is betting that its AI will be useful and a core part of healthcare in the coming decades. Google is serious about AI and machine learning. They talk about these things much more than any other company and focus on it as one of the main reasons Google has a bright financial future when they talk to Wall Street. So this shows their mentions of machine learning in their transcripts over time, which I pulled out of our earnings transcript database. The company isn't just building the AI themselves, but they're also one of the most active investors and acquirers of AI startups, which is especially important considering the pretty scarce pool of proficient AI researchers and architects right now. So Google's really putting its money up to stay a leader in this space. They're also developing their own tensor processing units, which are chips that are specifically designed to run AI applications. So it's not just software, but a hardware bent that they're bringing to the AI expertise too. And like I said, the company is seeing healthcare as a major area of impact for AI. Sundar Pichai said in an interview that trained algorithms can have a huge impact, especially in places like India or rural areas where that kind of medical expertise may not be available. So AI can really be the tool to democratize healthcare in a lot of ways. While AI is the main difference maker for the company as it approaches health, the fact that it has distribution and reach to consumers is going to help. They already have 7 different products with more than 1 billion users, so getting whatever they come out with into the hands of consumers isn't going to be a problem. Or vice versa, getting data from consumers through these avenues isn't necessarily a challenge for the company either. This is important though because most of the traditional players in healthcare, especially in the med device and pharma side, don't have the same direct access to their patients in that way. Also, a lot of these tools are ones that people who work in healthcare use in their own lives. So they actually understand the workflow and understand the kind of user experience they offer, which they probably don't get in healthcare. And that kind of bad user experience is probably exactly why Google has a much stronger likability than existing institutions in healthcare like insurance. People actually like Google, and that brand can actually help it as it enters the space. Finally, there's money. That's always helpful when you do basically anything. The company's cash pile of revenue seems to just keep growing. Of course, this doesn't mean they're necessarily going to spend all this money in healthcare, but they have the resources handy to weather long timelines, pay expensive upfront costs, and experiment to see what sticks. Distribution and cash are nice, but it's AI that Google is really selling here. The next section is going to focus on how Google is applying that AI to different areas of disease. I've broken down Google's health strategy into its activities along 3 different spaces. Data generation is the first, aka the actual stream of data that's required to understand a disease, whether that's images, data from wearables, or something else. The second is disease detection, so actually understanding when and what anomalies in the data means a specific disease might be present. And finally, there's management or intervention of disease after it's actually been detected. This map shows the main disease areas Google is currently looking at along those 3 dimensions. There's a lot on this slide, but I'm going to dive into each area separately, so you'll see it quite a few times. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about eye disease. Starting with the data generation layer, Google is working with Optos, a subsidiary at Nikon that makes the machines which take images of your retina. I was actually at the ophthalmologist yesterday, so I got to see one of these very recently. But anyway, with this partnership, Google has direct access to a stream of retinal images. This is great because the company has been putting out quite a bit of research using these kind of images to train algorithms to detect different kinds of disease. A few years ago, it proved that its algorithms could detect diabetic retinopathy through these retina images as well as trained ophthalmologists could. The company is working on detection of other types of eye disease as well. The company's DeepMind division is working with Moorfields Hospital in London to look through tons of OCT scans, which are a type of 3D eye scan that kind of look like this. And it helps the hospital triage the patients because before this project, any anomaly in the eye was basically just moved straight into urgent referral, even though there's obviously a spectrum of severity. So DeepMind is hoping that AI can actually look through this vast amount of data to help make those decisions faster and put patients into the appropriate buckets. Past just data generation and disease detection, Google is also working on its own solutions for slowly degenerating eyesight. It's working on ocular implants that can help combat presbyopia, which is when your eyes start to get worse and become harder to focus because the lens in your eye is becoming thicker and a little less elastic. The ocular implant has been a focus area for the company for a while, so our team took a look through our patents database at Verily's patents, analyzed the text, look at word frequency in the patents by year, and the contact lens and eye device has been a consistently high topic of the patents throughout the years. But even though it's a focus area, the status of the contact lens is unclear. The company is working with Novartis' subsidiary Alcon on the project, and after a delay a couple years ago, the project status is sort of up in the air. The contact lens actually had a dual function beyond just fixing presbyopia. It also claimed to be able to monitor glucose through tears. And this is part of their push into diabetes. For those of you that might remember, in 2014, there was a ton of media attention around Google's contact lenses that could detect tears. So I just thought I'd show a quick video here using our platform and looking at our trends tool, which monitors how we actually quantify that kind of attention. So when we look into glucose in Google, we can see that the spike in January is sort of around the contact lenses, and then later the company actually doubled down on diabetes with other companies like Sanofi. So why haven't we heard a ton about the contact lens project since then? Well, it's unclear whether or not tears can actually be used to measure glucose accurately. So some older studies suggest that they aren't good indicators, and there hasn't really been a ton of notable research since then to suggest any differently. So it's possible that Google realized the contact lens wasn't the best project to measure glucose, and so the company decided to explore other partnerships and avenues. And they've seemed to have a little bit more success going through some of the more traditional glucose sensing routes, like working with Dexcom on its continuous glucose monitoring device. In one of Dexcom's investor presentations, they actually talk about what their partnership with Verily might yield, which is a tiny, cheap glucose monitor you stick on yourself and only needs to be calibrated once every 2 weeks. The partnership and project actually become an increasing area of focus for Dexcom. So again, just a quick video to show you that when we look through their earnings calls, which we have a tool to do, in the last few quarters, the company actually brought up Verily several times. So the company has submitted their G6 continuous glucose monitoring sensor in conjunction with Verily to the FDA. And this is a good example of where Verily brought its expertise to make the product significantly better if it gets approved, and could be a pretty big game changer for Dexcom, which is probably why it's been talking about it a little bit. And the beauty of the partnership strategy is also the fact that Verily can actually leverage multiple partnerships together. So, for example, they're working with Sanofi on a diabetes management program called Onduo, which they've both invested $500 million into. Onduo's Welcome Kit actually has a Dexcom monitor, so I think that's what they call synergy in the world of business jargon. Onduo uses sensors, an app, and coaches to help people with type 2 diabetes manage their lifestyle. The company is partnering with regional insurance carriers in Arkansas, Georgia, and South Carolina. And as Google CEO Sundar Pichai said in the most recent earnings call, it's been slowly rolling its program out. So it's actually probably one of the furthest along in terms of commercial viability amongst Verily's projects. The company seems to have plans to expand Onduo too, with a patent on a smart syringe, specifically calling for a use case in diabetes. And also the company has stated it wants to eventually move into the type 1 diabetes space. So it might look at companies like Bigfoot Biomedical, which is sort of an AI-enabled type 1 diabetes monitoring system, or some of the artificial pancreas companies as potential inspiration, partners, or acquisition targets. So even though we have monitoring and disease management, the gap we're missing is earlier detection of the disease. So some companies like Cardiogram claim to be able to detect diabetes using existing heart rate monitors, including Android Wear, to be able to screen for diabetes using AI. So this could be one area Google explores itself to close the sort of diabetes vertical. And Onduo actually said in the previous slide that it wanted to expand into the early risk for diabetes population. So this might be one way to go about it. Going down the line of highly expensive chronic diseases, heart disease is another area of focus for the company. But before I go specifically into heart disease, it's worth talking a little bit about Verily's StudyWatch, which is the hardware that really enables the data generation layer across a ton of different diseases. So the sensors in the watch actually capture data from ECGs, heart rate, movement, electrodermal activity, and more. And it also has a large internal storage and processor baked in, plus it can receive updates over the air to enable different capabilities. So all of these data sets, but particularly the ECG and heart monitor ones, are helpful in detecting cardiovascular disease. Google is also trying to put sensors and cameras into everyday objects to make data collection more passive. So the company actually has a patent that uses optical sensors to look at blood flow and coloration to not only sense your cardiovascular function, but it could also detect certain issues like a stroke if there's coloration asymmetry. And that's not the only way that they aim to detect heart disease. They actually put out this really cool paper where they looked back at those retinal images I talked about earlier, and they were actually able to assess cardiovascular risk factors like age, smoking status, and more just through the flow of blood vessels in your eye. So the company's not only looking at typical places like your heart rate to find heart issues, but also trying to make detection of the disease happen in more places, like when you're visiting the ophthalmologist or at your home, so that it might be able to find different places to just detect the disease. Because, I mean, detecting the disease earlier through these means can actually help manage the disease better, and Google wants to find ways to prevent or reverse the disease in the first place. So it's given a $75 million grant with AstraZeneca to a doctor at Brigham and Women's Hospital to understand how heart disease develops and manifests. The details on this project are still pretty vague, but it could result in a similar coaching and management solution like Onduo, but for heart disease. As we move down the disease list, we go from diseases that we understand well to diseases we know much less about. So Parkinson's is one of those debilitating diseases that we just don't know much about, but Google wants to change that. The company is once again using the StudyWatch to capture as much data as possible and working together with a couple of universities and groups in the Netherlands that are studying the disease to combine the watch data with blood test and brain scan data from about 650 volunteers to track them as the disease develops and see if in the total data sets captured about them, we might be able to learn something about the disease. Verily's goal is using this data to, as the project name implies, personalize Parkinson's disease and treatment to different patients, since the disease actually manifests itself very differently from person to person. So by getting more data from different types of people, we might find people afflicted with Parkinson's that are more similar to each other, and then we can actually use that kind of data to fine-tune and power algorithms to figure out the best possible treatment paths or prevention activities for a given person. So while Google is still trying to learn more about the disease, it's still trying to help people who are afflicted with it today. The company acquired a startup called Lift Labs a few years ago, which made a tremor-resistant spoon for Parkinson's patients using advanced sensors, motors, and an onboard computer. Google has actually filed patents to expand on this spoon with new ways to detect what's on the spoon and if a person is actually eating, and connecting that data also together with caregivers, since malnutrition can actually really start to affect people, especially those who are with advanced neurological disorders. And finally, Google is taking on multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disease which attacks the myelin sheath in your brain and makes it difficult for the nervous system to communicate properly. Verily is working with Biogen and Brigham and Women's Hospital to build on top of existing research that the hospital's been doing. Its CLIMB study has been following more than 2,000 patients as they develop and battle multiple sclerosis. And now with Verily's AI expertise, as well as the Study Watch, they can capture data on more things like gait, mobility, dexterity, and then parse through these various data sets to hopefully find insights about the disease. Neither Google nor Verily has explicitly talked about interventions for MS, but another one of its projects with GSK creates these little miniature bioelectronics that can actually better manage electrical impulses through the body. So there's been some preliminary research into this area to help fix gait problems using these electroceuticals. But yeah, they could be used to help manage or prevent the disease from developing. There's some really early research that might support use of stimulation to actually prevent the spread of multiple sclerosis. Some researchers at Osaka, I believe, found that these T cells, which degenerate the nervous system, would actually get in through a certain part of the spinal cord. And then when they blocked the entrance there using stimulation, there were signs that the disease spread was actually slowing. But again, very early research. But in the future, this kind of research might actually inform decisions about what kind of interventions and even maybe with electroceuticals, how they can combat MS in the future. If not from the inside through electrical impulses, Google could also look to startups that help with mobility, like exoskeleton companies, which I just pulled a few quickly from the CBI platform. And similar to the Parkinson's spoon, these interventions are more used to help with the day-to-day activities and aren't as invasive. So we've gone through the disease areas that Google is tackling by making data, using AI to analyze the data, and then manage the disease. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the hints of other diseases they might also be moving into in the future, but first I want to talk a bit about their involvement in changing the healthcare data infrastructure. For some context on why they would want to get into this, moving data around from place to place in healthcare is a huge problem. Doctors say having this data is extremely critical, but barely any of them are actually able to access this data across different care settings. I'm actually curious more about the 21% of doctors that didn't think this data was critical, but that's for another briefing, I guess. Anyway, anyone that works in healthcare can tell you how massive of a problem interoperability is, and the fragmentation of data makes it really hard to build any third-party applications and move the field forward. And that's why Google wants to be the layer of data infrastructure that solves this problem, lets people build on top of it, and that's a really valuable place to be. To do this, they're targeting the existing health giants because they've probably learned from their past mistakes with trying to make a consumer health data product. Google Health, which I talked briefly about, began in 2008 and shut down 3 years later. People attribute the failure to different reasons: consumers not being everyday active participants in their health and not fantastic at uploading the data, difficulty getting buy-in from the health system, getting data out of EMRs. But either way, Google's trying to now work directly with the existing health system now instead of trying to go the consumer route. I like making lists, so I bucketed this into a three-pronged approach. The first is building pipes within health institutions, pushing services for people in healthcare that are built on top of their Google Cloud services, and also creating their own data sets for other people to build on top of. So starting with the new pipes that Google is building out. Google is trying to build the pipes by using a new data standard that's been slowly rolling out called FHIR, pronounced FHIR. I won't get into the technical details on how this works, but the documentation and explanation on the actual page from HL7 is pretty good. But basically, it creates standards for different data elements so that they can be universally understood and establish formats that are industry standards. So in general, FHIR hopes health data will operate more similarly to how web pages operate and allow us to build APIs, which are kind of like a data exhaust, basically. Some examples of where Google is doing this: the company's DeepMind division is working with NHS hospitals to create a new data infrastructure around FHIR, FHIR, which I highlighted here. By plugging into the hospital systems and organizing the data around FHIR, Google can open the floodgates for a host of applications to be built on top of it. And that includes their own apps. Google built an app called Streams to target acute kidney injuries in the hospital. And previously, that workflow actually required several people to escalate an issue, despite the time-sensitive nature of it. So Google's bet is that it can now build apps and serve specific functions where the analytics can really help with in-hospital monitoring processes. And it can do that now because it's basically created this new data infrastructure within these hospitals. DeepMind is one example, but Google is also helping build the data pipes through one of the companies it acquired called Apigee. Apigee lets companies manage their APIs and essentially gives them the tools to build their own workflows by making different systems connect to each other, assisted by Apigee, which is also using FHIR. On the website, Apigee has a few big healthcare names like Walgreens, McKesson, Cleveland Clinic, and more. And Apigee is actually a service that's offered through Google's cloud offering. The second way that Google is becoming part of this infrastructure is by pushing these kind of different services that are built on top of Google Cloud. As a whole, Google has really been pushing cloud as an evidence of the mentions during their earnings calls, and they've made some really high-profile hires like Diane Greene, and most tech companies are also trying to push their own cloud suites like AWS and Microsoft Azure. So this space is really heating up, and they're trying to find ways that they can actually differentiate their services. So Google wants to offer its own version of a HIPAA-compliant suite of services for health institutions to use. I talked before about how people who work at these institutions are comfortable using Google's tools in their personal lives. So having things like Google Docs in institutions means providing similar workflows that people are comfortable with at their place of work. So Google actually offers its G Suite specifically for healthcare to share data and images, manage calendars, help with the back office, and even things like Hangouts. But Google even says that the G Suite can basically be used to work outside of the constraints of the EMR system. So Google is trying to find their own method of bypassing the existing health IT infrastructure by potentially making their own on top of the cloud. Another service they offer are the open source tools that developers can use. Some of you might be familiar with TensorFlow, Google's open source machine learning software, but recently the company has been releasing health-specific tools like DeepVariant for genomic analysis. One of the benefits Google has here is that it has its own in-house lab team and the experts to help basically dog food the product and tweak it. In fact, building these tools out of a specific need could be an indicator of some of the other open source tools the company might be coming out with. At our AHA conference, Daphne Koller, who used to be at Calico, talked about how they developed a way to use machine vision to monitor different yeast cells, I believe, as they went through the aging process. So tools like that, like machine vision to monitor cells instead of actually manually watching, could be a hint at some other open source tools that come out in the future. And as more people develop on top of these tools and infrastructure, the more embedded Google becomes in the infrastructure and the easier it is to sell into other Google tools and offerings on its cloud platform. While the first two methods are Google helping you use your own data, the company is also trying to build its own data sets for you to build on top of. In one example, Google is working with the NIH on their All of Us initiative, previously known as a Precision Medicine Initiative, which seeks to track a diverse pool of 1 million people and know as much as possible about their genetics, environment, lifestyle, health, and more. Verily was tapped by the NIH in 2016 and given a 5-year grant alongside the Broad Institute and Vanderbilt University to build out the data infrastructure and analysis tools to house the data from the first 79,000 participants. The goal is for a community of researchers to analyze the data or use it in their own research to discover novel insights about our health. Separately, Verily is also conducting its own study called Project Baseline, in which it's creating its own data sets from 10,000 voluntary participants over 4 years. If enrolled, participants can monitor their everyday activities using a study watch, using a sleep sensor to monitor their sleeping patterns, and answering regular survey questions via mobile or email, and visiting a participating site 4 times a year for a variety of tests. The study is expected to cost more than $100 million, which is where that cash pile advantage I was talking about in the beginning comes in handy. From their informed consent form, the company suggests that it's building out a database with a possible goal of letting third-party researchers build on top of. I actually signed up for the study to get the informed consent form to look at, but it's pretty clear that building a third-party research community is in the cards potentially. And so that's everything Google is currently working on, from trying to manage your disease with AI to building an infrastructure for other people to build on top of in healthcare. In the last section, we make some guesses about where the company might go next. Hopefully this looks familiar. We know some of the disease areas Google's already targeting, but which are other areas I might consider next? COPD, cancer, mental and behavioral health, and the disease of aging seem to make the most sense. COPD is one of the big chronic disease cost drivers that Google doesn't seem to have an explicit venture into yet, but would make a lot of sense for them to get into. The Study Watch can already capture some of the environmental data, which might help understand what triggers an episode, and more interestingly, they acquired a company called Synosis Health in 2017, which claims to be able to use existing smartphones to detect hemoglobin levels and monitor pulmonary function, so it might be able to detect the disease earlier. And then on the intervention side, again, not said explicitly, but from that same GSK deck about electroceuticals, they highlighted asthma and COPD as potential target areas. Cancer is a widespread and pretty poorly understood disease that affects a lot of people. Google has some feelers in the space already. On the data generation side, it has an investment in an early cancer detection startup called Freenome, which I mentioned is working in their lab, and they capture data from circulating tumor DNA in the bloodstream. They've put out a paper on how their machine learning algorithms can identify tumors pretty reasonably well, and its DeepMind division is working with the NHS to help design radiotherapy treatments for head and neck cancer, which is really complex due to the cancer's proximity around the nerves. Interestingly, the company was also involved in a study a very long time ago to see whether peer support might help cancer patients by talking to each other who went through the process. And even though the results were never published, it's possible that they might explore this angle with a new perspective. The main gap here is that Google doesn't have access directly to the CT and MRI scans, so a partnership with companies that do, like Samsung for example, could make sense. Mental and behavioral health is also a not super well understood phenomenon, and it's coming more in the spotlight nowadays. Google has a partnership with the National Alliance of Mental Illness to provide a survey with people that search about mental illness, which is where that product distribution advantage I talked about comes in handy. But this could potentially help direct people to mental or behavioral health support avenues if they feel like they need it. The detection part could come from one of their portfolio companies, Quartet Health, which helps primary care docs detect and assist people that might have mental health disorders. The gap here is the treatment and intervention. Google could potentially work with mobile-based therapy, CBT, or coaching to help people who might be afflicted, and they actually have a job posting specifically for someone to direct the research and product in the behavioral health space. And finally, there's aging, which isn't really a secret since Google's working on this pretty explicitly, and we talked about Calico a few times, but the company is basically trying to find ways to fight the Grim Reaper. It put out an interesting paper about how naked mole rats actually don't age the traditional way, and its goal is to work with biotech firms on drugs that might be able to prevent some of the processes that degrade due to aging. Outside of new disease, a few other areas we think Google might go into. They could be making new tools and hardware specifically for providers. If you remember Google Glass, it actually has a surprising uptake in the medical community, apparently. So Google might see this as an avenue, as an opportunity to assist doctors. One example is our partnership with Johnson & Johnson to create Verb Surgical, which wants to make surgery robots and has a few patents on ways it might go about doing that, which you can actually see in our patent database. Google also has a patent on using machine vision and a cuff to conduct an abdominojugular reflex test, which is one that actually requires a lot of precision since you have to watch a vein basically move a very small amount. And there's actually a lot of variance between how doctors do that test. So Google might see a role in using AI to essentially create a standard for these kind of tests. It's not just doctors, but Google could potentially go down the patient-facing side. We talked about how Google's strategy has shifted to focus mainly on existing health institutions instead of consumers after the Google Health bust, but it has avenues to do so. Google's new Pixel phone and Home Assistant are its own forays into combining hardware and AI to make what it believes is a new, much better experience. And it could use these as new ways to diagnose people, improve adherence, help manage lifestyles while at home, and more. The company could also build new hardware. It has a patent on a concussion diagnostic test for a headset, which may be a leftover from its Google Glass days, but it could also come out with its own consumer version of the Study Watch. Or instead of targeting each individual at a time, it could look to health more at a population level and intervene there. For example, it's working to engineer and release sterile mosquitoes with the hope of reducing the infection-carrying population, and I really hope that they've thought through the long-term potential outcomes here. I'm going to hopefully assume they have. They've also spun out a company called CityBlock, which aims to help manage the health of Medicaid and Medicare patients by providing more care avenues closer to their communities and potentially gather a lot of data and automate more processes via AI to make it a scaled, scalable services businesses to manage this pretty high-touch patient population. Or in the future, it could explore other population health interventions. I thought some potentially interesting ones could be with its self-driving unit, Waymo, to understand the health of passengers in cars or conduct low-risk checkups using tools in the car. Or another could be applying AI to livestock health, which is what a company called Canthus is doing here to potentially prevent the spread of disease from the agricultural system downstream. And finally, when you wrap all of these things together, if Google really believes that its AI and AI-enabled processes are a huge improvement on the existing health system, then they should actually take on some risk and put their money where their mouth is. And that seems to be exactly what they're doing. They have an open position for a health plan executive and have apparently been in talks to negotiate Medicaid contracts in some states. In the future, it's possible Google, the search giant, will also be Google, the health insurer / population health manager. The question is whether they can actually pull it off. Amongst other obstacles, the perception that Google sells personal data is going to be tricky to get around, especially when it comes to health insurance. But considering most people likely don't like their current health insurers, providing a much better customer experience and AI-enabled tools sounds like it could be an attractive enough offering to enroll people and should make health insurers think about their own offerings. So that's all the time we have for now. We got through 100 slides, so I appreciate everyone staying with me and hope it was informative. I'll use the rest of the time to take questions and try to answer as many as I can. So thanks. All right, let's look through some of these. All right, let's see. So the Google Launchpad, what role does the Google Launchpad play? Google Launchpad, actually, it's their startup studio, for those that don't know. Actually, the first batch of startups from the Google Launchpad play, I believe, is actually focused on AI and machine learning in healthcare. So that was clearly like the first priority they thought of when they thought of the Launchpad, and it sort of flows into what I was talking about before about them trying to increase their exposure to early stage companies. Let's see. So there are a few questions about how Google and regulation sort of interplay with each other and how they're planning to overcome that. That's a good question. Interestingly, Google, I believe I read that Google actually upped their lobbying spend for its other bets, which include its healthcare bets. So they're clearly, I think, sort of trying to make their presence in sort of the regulatory environment known. But they're also targeting Medicaid as their first population, apparently, in the health insurance side, which is largely a government contract-based area. So clearly, Google sees the government and sort of regulatory bodies as a potential avenue for their technologies. How do you see Google stacking up against the Amazon, JP Morgan, Berkshire partnership? There aren't a ton of details on that partnership, so we can only really speculate at this point. It seems just from the advantages the companies have and what they sort of talked about that they're targeting a little bit more on the health benefits side of the equation. So Google seems to be talking a little bit more about as sort of a tool that self-insured employers or health insurance plans might use. So I don't think they're necessarily in competition with each other. It could be complementary. Do you think Google will get into the pharmacy realm? Again, really anything is possible, but their expertise area is much more in sort of AI tools. So Amazon seems to be a little bit more of a natural fit for pharmacy and medical supply distribution. There might be specific areas that Google sees as an opportunity there, but I think they kind of have their hands full, it looks like. What about Google and senior care? So Cityblock is based in, and also they're pushing the Medicaid. Cityblock is sort of focused on both the Medicaid and Medicare population, so it's looking at both. And also a lot of the tools I talked about, like Google Home, for example, could be really useful plays in just sort of establishing a presence in a person's home, especially in the elderly, where a lot of sort of incidents and high-cost incidents might happen in the home. Plus, Google Home is also a pretty universally understand user interface, so the ramp up for maybe some of the elderly population would be pretty fast. Let's see. So which will be the countries of first choice outside of the US for Google to offer the healthcare products and services? Considering DeepMind's sort of deep expertise and sort of relationships with the NHS and in the UK, that seems like a pretty sort of obvious first step. Like I said, they have this partnership with Temasek too to sort of potentially branch out into China, but China's always a little trickier just because of the sort of regulatory environment there, and also there are a lot of existing large tech giants there like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent that are also working on these problems. So Europe would probably be the most natural course. Also India, considering there's a big push happening right now to sort of build out the IT infrastructure in India and change a lot of how healthcare functions there. And also, like in that interview, Sundar Pichai talked specifically about democratizing sort of AI to rural areas in India. Let's see. What else? How does Apple's focus on healthcare compare with Google's? So, like I said in this presentation, Google is much more focused on working really on the health enterprise side, so integrating or working alongside insurers and hospitals. Apple is really on the other side, so they're very focused more on the consumer approach, and we have a lot of research related to Apple's sort of strategy in healthcare, but Apple seems to be working much more in putting data and putting data in the hand of the patient and sort of building out an entire sort of consumer health vertical, a little bit more focused on primary care, using the phone as kind of a lever into that space. So I'll take a few more, and then I should probably wrap up. Let's see. Based on the available data and where Google is heading, where do you think organizations, hospitals such as Kaiser Permanente, United Health Group, Anthem, Aetna will evolve? So we've already seen a lot of these insurance companies and hospitals already making a lot of big moves in response to tech giants sort of entering the space. CVS, Aetna, for example, was pretty implicitly tied to Amazon's announcements of getting involved in the space. So Google seems to be approaching the space more from a partnership angle. It's possible that they might get more competitive on areas like Medicaid contracts, but those are also areas that have been relatively neglected by existing payers. So if Google sort of poses a threat to these companies, I kind of assume that they will figure out their own ways to respond, but for now the company seems to be taking more of a partnership approach. I'm going to take one more question and then sort of try to answer as many as possible through email. So if I haven't gotten your question, please feel free to shoot me an email. Has Google sought any partnership with physician groups to train its AI diagnostic database? Google actually has a lot of providers and physician groups on staff through their own subsidiaries, but it's also working with several physician groups and the NHS and hospitals themselves to help train its AI diagnostics. So it's not working on this in a vacuum. It is getting input from people who actually use these kind of tools. Okay, so that's pretty much all the time I have right now. Again, if I didn't get to your question, please feel free to shoot me an email. It's nkrishnan@cbinsights.com, and hopefully this was useful. Thanks.